Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is Aziza, one of your co hosts for today, founder of Own Your Own Narrative 54, global consultant, and class of 2023 MIPAD honoree.
Hello, everyone. This is Imor. I'll be co-hosting with Aziza, and I'm an academic as well as a business consultant and a best-selling author, and a MIPAD honoree from the class of 2023.
And you're listening to the Voices of Influential People podcast, or as we like to call it, the VIP, a show brought to you by the most influential people of African descent, MIPAD, aimed at connecting you to the most influential people of African descent worldwide. Today's episode is Global Black History, and we are honored to have as our special guest Dr. Sheila S. Walker, a cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the global African diaspora. She is also a global advisor to MIPAD, the most influential people of African descent. Welcome, Dr. Walker, to the Voices of Influential People podcast. Thank you for being with us.
I'm thrilled to be with you, and I'm thrilled to be with such influential people talking about other influential people on the planet.
Wonderful. And so we like to break things down a little bit regarding location because we know we are a global podcast. So, I'm dialing in or calling in from the US and my co-host.
Calling in from the UK, Coventry in the Midlands.
So we would love to know where actually in the world are you, because we know you have traveled and traversed many places. So where are you today, Dr. Walker?
This is true. I'm in Washington, D.C., and as I look out of my window, I see Virginia, first of all, which is right across the river. And I see monuments, and I like being here. It's a nice international city.
Wonderful. And you're staying warm too, I hope.
Oh, yeah. I read someplace that there's no bad weather, just bad clothes. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
True, very true.
Yes, so true, so true. We also like to do another little bit of an icebreaker with you, just to see what are some of your likes when it comes to film. So we would love to know, what is your favorite film and why?
Oh, my favorite film. Maybe this is what came to mind first. Daughters of the Dust.
Oh, that's a good
And
one.
why do I like it? I saw it. I was in Massachusetts when I saw it, and it was winter. And it was cold, and there was no color where I was except, some green trees. And so to see such a warm film with warm colors and all of those African descendants with such a rich culture.
Yes.
So that film has really stuck in my mind. I'm sure I've seen lots of other films since, but that's what came to my mind. And to think that these were Gullah Geechee people who are the African descendants who have preserved their African culture the most in the United States. So just all that warmth was great, and all of the cultural references made me feel warm in a place that was so cold.
Absolutely.
Oh,
It's a classic, and just the beautiful display of Black people, like just the visual in and of itself is a amazing, story and powerful image. So
The cultural references.
yes.
For example, there was the character Yellow Mary.
Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
if you look at that, and I always look at things in a larger context. So if you look at that in the context of the Americas, for example, then you have to think about the presence of religion of Yoruba origin in Brazil and Cuba, and you have to
hmm.
think about Yellow Mary as Oshun.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
Love
Yes.
that.
Love
Love that.
it. Yeah.
Love that.
The
And
symbolism.
I
Yes.
can relate to that. Good stuff.
Absolutely. There's so much symbolism in
Yeah.
there. And you have had an amazing journey yourself, personally and professionally throughout the African diaspora, from starting as a college student with this amazing host family that you stay with in Cameroon up into your professional journey now. And so we want to actually start off, the discussion by seeing if you could tell us, and share more about your journey, and some of the most impactful milestones and challenges that you faced along the way to becoming the leader, the influencer, the inspiration that you are today in your field.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for asking me to think back at how I got here. I think it all started. I'm from New Jersey. And as a little kid, I had the feeling that New Jersey wasn't the whole world, that there was something else out there. And part of the reason, for which I knew that was I had an aunt, my grandmother's sister, who lived in Chinatown in New York. Now, she wasn't Chinese, she was African American like the rest of the family, but Chinatown was cheap, and African Americans could live in another community of color. It was also on the subway line, and that mattered. You go to work.
That's
Um,
good.
yeah, but watching the Chinese people, she didn't have a television, she didn't have any kids, so the adults would talk about the adult stuff that didn't interest me, and I would look out of the window at these Chinese people, and I wondered why I didn't understand them. I didn't know there were other languages. I was 4, I'd never heard anything but English, and I was learning to read and write, and I couldn't find those words I knew or those letters I knew, so that intrigued me, plus Chinese New Year's. They have dragons. Where I lived, there were no
Yeah.
dragons. So I figured someplace on the planet, somebody had dragons, and I wanted to know, how can we get there? Um, I lived on the we lived in Jersey on the Atlantic Ocean. We would go swimming at the beach, and I thought maybe I can swim over there. Well, that didn't work. But so I always had the desire to know who else is on the planet with me and what are they doing and what do they speak and how am I gonna get to know them? Well, I was 4. I got to be 6, but I still I didn't get to go anyplace. Um, but I kept that desire to go someplace, and when I went to college, I was the colored girl in my class, and I went to an elite college, Bryn Mawr. So, it was a privileged education, but I was used to some Black folks, and, so I needed some cultural balance, and I can't say that I was poorly treated. No. But I needed some cultural balance, and so I learned of the Experiment in International Living, an exchange program that allowed college students, U.S. college students, to go abroad, which meant Europe at that point.
Mhm.
But the summer when I needed to go someplace, they had a program in Cameroon, and so I
Oh,
automatically chose Cameroon, and I decided to that was part of making it challenging. I also went to the French-speaking part of Cameroon. So
okay.
I
Did you speak French? Did you know French?
I was studying French like,
Oh,
everybody else. You know how you study those languages in
yes.
high school and college and you don't learn how to talk?
So it was a real immersive
Oh, yeah. So I stayed with this family, and they were wonderful. I mean, it was from them that I learned French. And that was the era of Tarzan. So Tarzan was that's how Africa was represented,
Mm,
by this very intelligent white man and the dumb Africans who, uh, he was so able to they were gullible, and so he was so able to show his superiority. There were
yep.
also he had some more friends, Tarzan did. There was Jungle Jim, and there was Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who wore a
Yes,
leopard
yes.
skin or something. And so I thought, well, that's all very interesting. I mean, it didn't have anything to do with me as an African American. And then I met Africans who said, oh, I love Tarzan. I wondered where that was. Clearly it wasn't Africa. Anyway, so I needed balance, and I went to Cameroon, and I stayed with this great family in the capital of a kingdom, the Bamoun
Oh,
Kingdom.
wow.
Yeah.
yeah.
So I didn't see Tarzan at all. What I saw rather than Tarzan was the Babylon people had 2 museums.
Mm.
They had a royal family that lived in a palace that the father of the king when I was there had built at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was restored by UNESCO in the 1990s. He had also created a writing system for his language
Mm,
and wrote books in his writing system, created schools. And when the French arrived to colonize the Cameroonians,
mhm.
and when they got to the Bemon, the first thing they did was close King Joya's schools. And
Oh
I
my
thought, wait a
goodness.
minute, I think I know something about that. During enslavement in the United States, it was a crime for African Americans, free or enslaved, to know how to read and write. So
Mm,
the issue when you know how to read and write is that you have access to knowledge, your own knowledge. So I thought it was very interesting that colonization and enslavement had some of the exact same mechanisms, keep
Mm.
these folks down by keeping them unable to have their own thoughts. But so that was the beginning of my discovering Africa and the diaspora. I had no idea that there was an African diaspora at that point. Obviously, I didn't learn anything about that in college, zero. But I go to Cameroon. I stay with this family. They haven't gone to fancy colleges. They have a party. And I think, oh, wow, African drums, right? No, records, Afro Cuban records, as a matter of fact. And,
Some good
Okay.
grooves, some good grooves.
oh, yeah. And the Cameroonians at the party said, "How come you can dance to our music?" And I said, "This is our music." They said, "Well, how do you know how to dance to it?" "I'm from Jersey." That's why. I'm not from Ohio.
That's right.
We were lucky to be in kind of the cultural sphere of all that wonderful Afro-Cuban, Afro-Puerto Rican culture. So, yeah, I know how to
Yeah.
dance. But I also got a sense that they knew about other people of African origin more than I did. They asked me, "Do you know Pelé from Brazil?" "Huh? What does that have to do with me?" "Do you know Sparrow from Trinidad?" "What does that have to do with me? I'm from the United States." Well, it was those Cameroonians who taught me that that had everything to do with me.
Mhm.
That Brazil, Trinidad, at another party, we had music from Guadeloupe, from,
Mm.
other places in Africa and the African diaspora, high life from Ghana. At my fancy college, I wasn't becoming very Afro-international. On the
Mhm.
contrary.
Mhm.
So these Africans helped me get to know that there is a global African diaspora, that it has something to do with me. And because of them, when I went to Ecuador, for example, and met people in Congo, I had done a little genealogy and knew that my great grandmother, the Indian, of course, back when we didn't have any African ancestors, they were
Mhm.
all Indians, Native Americans.
Mhm.
My great grandmother, the Native American, her name was Amelia Congo. So when I met people in Ecuador and in Congo, what could I say? Yo, cuz.
Yes.
But so it was in Africa that I learned that there was a global African diaspora and that I needed to find out more about it.
Mhm.
And that's what I've been doing ever since, thanks to the Njoya family in Fumban and Cameroon and the Bemoit Kingdom.
Yes, we have to remember to say their names because wow, like that is such an amazing journey and platform. And I know that as we talk about our collective African ancestry, through culture, it builds bridges and through music and food and all these amazing historical facts, education, knowledge sharing. One of those core tools is communication and storytelling. And we know that that has been something that is, so important in the work that you've done through your documentaries, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, and Familiar Faces in Unexpected Places, a global African diaspora. And so we want to delve into that other aspect of storytelling and know and understand why has storytelling been foundational and valuable both in your work and in the communities that you're engaging with.
Well, I think one of the things with respect to storytelling for us to understand is that we in the Americas tell African stories, whether we know it or not. But, for example, Anansi, the trickster spider from the
Yes.
Akan-speaking
Yes.
people of Ghana and Ivory Coast. Anansi's all over the place. And you find Anansi in various of the languages, official languages
Mhm.
of the African diaspora in the Americas. You find Anansi
Mhm.
in Colombia, in Ecuador,
Yes.
Pacific coast of South America. You can't get farther away from Africa than the Pacific coast of South America. They tell Anansi stories. They tell Anansi stories in Suriname. Suriname on the, let's
Yep.
see, it's northeast of South America, Dutch officially, Dutch speaking country, where Anansi he's there too. Jamaica, Nancy stories. Southern United States, Aunt Nancy. So that shows us one, where Akan speaking people are in the Americas, where they were brought in voluntarily. Um, for various reasons. Colombia and Ecuador is because of gold. They were known as gold miners, negros minas, because they had gold mining technology. Brer Rabbit, Brer Rabbit. And now I knew him in Jersey, okay? But
Yes.
he is Tio Conejo, Uncle Rabbit in Ecuador, Compe Lapin at Martinique, Guadeloupe. Le Lièvre, there's a book co-written by one of the earlier presidents of Senegal, Leopold Sédar Senghor, about Le
Yeah,
Lièvre.
yeah, yeah.
And I had a friend, he's an ancestor now in Ecuador, who's also a storyteller, so he could tell both the Nazi stories and Brer Rabbit stories.
Mhm.
And he was telling a Brer Rabbit story to a visitor he had from Burkina Faso in West Africa. One stopped to have a drink of water. The Burkinabe continued the same story in exactly the same way that one would have continued it. So, what's the importance of that? Well, we know that how African culture has survived in many places, and if you know that there are, for example, Anansi stories. Well, what else is there? Um, so that shows us, one, the continued connections between Africa and the Americas, other parts of the world also. And it shows us similarities that we have among ourselves, because there are those who are trying to help us not know each other and not know what we have in common. It's up to us to know what we have in common. And
Yes.
that makes me think of Afro-Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen, who in one of his poems, the refrain is, "Without knowing each other, we will recognize each other."
Hmm.
Mm.
That's deep. Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Mm.
in my film, Scattered Africa, two people use that refrain without having planned it. I don't know if they knew each other. A man from Uruguay, Tomaso Oliveira Chirimini, and a woman from Brooklyn, New York. Both of them said,
Mhm.
as Nicolas Guillen said, in talking about our commonalities and what the things that bring us together, if we know what we're talking about.
Yes.
Oh, that was amazing. I just took some notes down. What you said. Especially the point where you said, without knowing each other, we could still recognize each other. I think that is so deep. And you've talked a lot about how you discover yourself as a Black person. Well, it would be great if you could just go back a bit again and tell us how or what it meant to be a Black in the US. How has that understanding of being Black in the US evolved over time? How,
Hmm.
how, how has it changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm from the North, okay? So I never experienced official segregation. Um, but that's not to say that I didn't know about segregation. But I never saw whites only signs. However, however, I don't think you can grow up Black in the United States and not be aware that there's something going on. And you're told in various ways, and it's not always so overt. For example, when I was in first grade, we had two reading groups. I was the colored girl in my class again, and the bluebirds and the robins. And the robins were the fastest readers, and I was put at the end of the bluebirds. Now, my name is Walker, not Aaron, so it could have been that. But that was pretty. I think I noticed that. However, I ended the year in the first seat of the Robins because I had to show people, one of the things that it has been an obligation, it's responsibility to the race. So we know that we have to work harder to um, essentially not to be considered equal, but to be considered almost equal. You work 4 times as hard, you make less money, and according to statistics, and then you're considered in some way deficient. And so I remember my father really wanted me to go to Bryn Mawr. It was considered the best women's college in the country. And he said, well, there will be people who will want to look down at you. And I want them to have to look up to you to look down at you.
Mm.
Oh, but at that point, we were not African Americans were not thinking about any kind of connections with Africa. On the contrary, what did Africa have to do with me? People were saying then, people are still saying now, but now it's less excusable. I ain't left nothing in no Africa. So what do I have to why do I need to even think about Africa? But I had a stepmother who worked for the American Society for African Culture. So I, in high school, learned something about Africa. As so, she what one of the American Society for African Culture was created in New York to create links between the newly independent African countries and U.S. African Americans, artists, political types,
Mm.
the few of
Mhm.
those that there were at that time, and so now she was my stepmother. We were not always the best of friends, but she was my best accomplice for leading the kind of life I wanted to live. She would organize fancy events for people like Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, Nnamdi
Mm.
Azikiwe. So
Oh.
I heard about those people, and they became. I didn't meet them. I was a kid, but they were real for me. And she had a party, for example, and invited Lionel Hampton, Randy Weston. I remember Randy Weston
Oh.
playing
Yeah.
on our baby grand piano. Um, dun, 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 dun. Can't remember its name right now, but I do remember it.
Yeah.
Now, I played that same piano. It didn't come out the same. Not at all. But so I got a sense that Africa was not just Tarzan. There was something else going on in Africa, and then Africa began to become part of my life. Like when I was in college, I was the colored girl, right? So I didn't have a what I considered a normal social life at all at Bryn Mawr, but I met some African students, and without understanding all of the whys, I understood that we had something in common. First of all, we could all dance, and um, and at the last MIPAD event in New York, there was a moment that an Afro-Colombian reminded me of. We, whoever we were, uh,
Mhm.
several people from the MIPAD group went to Guantanamera,
Oh.
the
Mhm.
Yeah.
a restaurant.
Yes.
And we were just supposed to eat, but we wound up dancing because, we just had to dance. And people from all kinds of different places wound up dancing to the same rhythms without knowing where we were from, without knowing what we spoke. We were in the rhythm. So
Yeah.
without knowing each other, there we were.
Yes. Yes.
Oh. Oh, that's lovely. In the rhythm. In the rhythm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you look at your journey, and it's great to hear all of the stories, just so impactful. You've shown exemplary leadership, literally, even from the time you're very little, growing up. And so, as a leader in your field, because you epitomize that, how would you balance the preservation of cultural heritage with the promotion of progress within the African diaspora?
Uh, well, I must say there was a little opposition to my doing this, from my professors, my colleagues, professors at the University of Chicago, colleagues at the University of California at Berkeley, who were not really in my corner. Um, but I always had a Black community, and it just got bigger and bigger. Uh, it started when I stayed with this family about which I knew nothing in Cameroon, but then I began to consider that family my family also, and I had conversations with my Cameroonian parents when they were saying, "Oh, you're a daughter," and I said, "Yeah." So I consider that I had 2 well, 3 3 sets of parents, 3 mothers, 3 fathers. So my birth mother and my birth father, my Cameroonian mother and my Cameroonian father, my stepmother, who was not always my best friend, but ultimately was my best friend, and my mother would agree with that, my first mother. And among the Bamoun, when someone dies, someone else takes his or her place. And
Oh,
so I
wow.
got a new Cameroonian father. He's a little younger
Yes.
than I am, but that's a technicality. That's just the way things work.
Right.
But, I guess ever since that first time when I went to Cameroon, I was 19, and I have I kind of felt that it was my mission to help us in Africa and the African diaspora know about each other, know what we had in common, and know that we had so much in common. And one of the things that happened on my first trip to Cameroon, I wasn't looking for ancestors. I had no idea that we had ancestors in Africa.
Right.
I had no idea the cultural connections. I started learning at the party, but also like food, you have to eat. And I
Mhm.
hated the food initially.
Yeah.
The first week we had my Cameroonian mother, I think, decided, well, she has to adjust to a lot. So let me just make the food part easy. So we had grilled chicken and French fries and string beans. And then suddenly we had fufu. And when I
Mhm.
looked at big white
Yeah.
balls of stuff,
I love it, man.
well, I thought it looked like uncooked bread dough. And I was just being like, but and I thought, oh, I don't like these greens.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I found that those greens were like the greens we have here,
Yes, yes.
turnips, mustards, and
Mhm.
I just like them. And that white stuff that I hated, well, that was kind of like grits.
Mhm.
So I began to like
Exactly.
food. I now consider, uh, I don't know, I guess I was going to say probably all of the African food I've had, I consider it soul food.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
African, Caribbean,
Mhm.
and we are not at all aware of how African some of our foods are. We have like okra gumbo.
Yes.
Please, both of
Mhm.
those words are African.
Yes,
And
yes.
people think, well, I make gumbo with no okra. Well, you can't. Or you may, okay? Because gumbo is the root word for the thing we call okra, that in
Mhm.
Ghana is called nkrumah, that gave us okra, I think, one of the possible origins of that term. Well, how are you going to make gumbo without the gumbo?
Mhm. Mhm.
Without the
Mhm.
okra,
Mhm.
right? So if we could see those connections, then we would understand ourselves better. Going to Africa and the African diaspora in the Americas helped me understand, for example, our spirituality. You know,
Yes, yes, yes,
when you go to
yes.
one of those churches where people feel
Mhm.
the spirit and they
That's
got to
right.
out and dance the spirit. Well, I didn't understand that until I went to Brazil and I went to a
Mhm.
candomblé ceremony and I thought, oh, I get it.
It's all coming together.
Yes, yeah, and
Yes.
there's so much
Mhm.
of what we do that we
Yes.
can't understand if we don't understand the African roots,
Mhm. Very
like,
true.
Mm.
like church.
Yes. Yes. There's a
Words.
thread through it all. It's such a, such a thread through everything. And one of the other areas that we look at, unfortunately, is that thread of injustice, the injustice that is faced here for Black people of African descent in America, South America, Latin America, on the continent in and of itself. And so we want to delve into it a little bit when we're looking at your work and how it actually addresses the injustices and also creates a future that, honors Black history.
Yes, thank you. I don't focus on the injustices because enough people do. They don't need me. But I think it's important for us to learn about, of course, we were oppressed. We know that. We know about enslavement. Africans know about colonization. We don't know enough about either, but they are connected. And if you think, let's see, my professors tried to teach me officially that Africans brought nothing to the Americas. They came as, and this is a word I got, an expression I got from them, tabula rasa,
Hmm.
blank slates. Now, how much
Yes.
sense does that make? And it's not true. What is true is that Africans were brought by Europeans and Euro Americans to the Americas to develop
Hmm.
the new societies, new in the sense
Yes.
of post genocide of the indigenous people from
Hmm.
Chile to Canada. So when I talk about Americas, I mean the whole thing,
Yes.
Chile to Canada, not just the
Yes.
United States. But Africans were specifically recruited from specific places in Africa because of their knowledge. So we need to look at the enslavement process as a transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas. Gold mining in the Americas was African. Agriculture. Everybody would have starved to death were it not for Africans.
Yes.
Rice culture in the United States, the Caribbean, South America. Where'd that rice come from? What is called the Rice Coast, Senegal to Liberia. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the process of enslavement was systematic and it was a forced brain drain. So
Mm-hmm.
we need to understand that. And that does two things. One, it makes us understand not just the suffering, but the triumphs in spite
Mm-hmm.
of. And it makes us understand connections.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like the vice president of Colombia. I love this. Her name is Francia Marquez. Mina is a common family name on the Pacific
Oh,
coast of Colombia and in
okay.
Ecuador. What does it mean? Mine, gold mine. And so that suggests that her ancestors, like those other people called Mina, were gold experts brought to the Americas to enrich the Europeans who brought them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really important for us to understand. I left nothing to no Africa. Right, we brought it with us. That's why our ancestors were brought here, because of what they knew, their skills and their knowledge. So that's really
Yes.
important. So a part of what we need to do is get rid of the lies and replace the lies with a little truth. And it's documented. So I can understand, if I were European and enslaved somebody, I would not then say, well, I enslaved this person because he or she was more intelligent than I.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
they had, the enslavers had to come up with a way of justifying their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Saying that Africans and African descendants were somehow inferior. Inferior how? They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Europeans did have superior weapons of mass destruction.
Mm-hmm.
No, there's no question about that. But what did they use them for?
Right. 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 And how
Mm.
powerful, of that foundation still is resonating today within the growth and the economies and,
Yeah.
all of those, it hasn't ended.
No, you're absolutely right. And we can't understand the present without understanding how we got here, how it happens that we are not when you consider that Africans, first of all, were the majority of the human beings in the Americas for the first 300 of the 500 years of the modern Americas,
Mhm.
Africans and African descendants. So that means that the basis of these societies, the basis was created by Africans and African descendants. However, the wealth didn't go to the people who brought the knowledge and skills because of the oppressive system that was imposed throughout the Americas. So we need to understand that so as to understand the present. Everybody needs to understand that to understand the present. And um, it makes sense for some people to want to get rid of African American studies
Mhm. Mhm.
because it tells things that it tells a
Mm.
different story of the Americas, of the Atlantic world, the whole Atlantic world. And
Yes.
the story that those of us who are involved in telling a story of people of African descent globally,
Mhm.
that story is documentable, you
Yes.
know?
Yes.
And it's all of us. It's
Mhm.
something we all have in common. So not just the oppression, but the need to rectify the story.
Incredible, incredible. We could just keep you for the whole day, but your time your time is super precious, and because of this, I mean, we so as you know, we've been engaging with the audience, and we have quite a number of questions, but because of the time, we only have space for just one audience question, and if you're okay, I'll just read that off.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm a young woman aspiring to be like you.
Wow.
And so if you had one major advice for me, what would that be?
Travel, travel, travel.
Okay.
But not as a tourist. You have to get to know people, and being a tourist is a great way not to get to know people. But travel, being open, being humble. Like the first time I went to Cameroon, I was so aware of my ignorance. I didn't know how to be a polite human being in Cameroon. The family I lived with, they insisted that I was going to learn. But travel, go places in the African diaspora. And you need to go, well, I mean, you need to go to more than one place, but it's good to start with one place and learn how to speak somebody else's language.
Mm,
So traveling is so enriched if you could talk to people. First of all, if you're from the United States or an English speaking culture and you can learn somebody else's language, those people are going to be shocked that you have made the effort to learn
mm,
how to communicate. But
Mhm.
so those are, I would say, travel, learn languages, learn the languages of the African diaspora. Um,
mm.
I directed the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And some people came and said, "We want to learn Swahili." And I said, "Great idea. If you bring enough students and we'll find somebody to teach Swahili, you can learn Swahili." "Why Swahili?" "Well, it's an African language." "Well, yes, it is. And it's an international African language. It's
Mhm.
useful." But I said, "You know what?" And this is going to sound a little colonized. I would first learn the language, the colonial languages,
Mhm.
because all Africans and African diasporans who have gone to school have probably learned English. And so we who speak English have a certain advantage. It's convenient. But Portuguese. Now, we in the
Mm.
United States think we're the majority of the African diaspora. That's just false. There are many more Afro Brazilians than there are of us, like two and a half
Yes.
times. Okay.
Mhm.
The first Black country in the world is Nigeria, of course. The second is Brazil. So Brazil has more people of African origin than most African countries. So that's a useful language too. Plus, you really shock people in Brazil if you say anything in Portuguese. You say, "Oh,
Mm.
I tudo bem. Oh, you speak so well." I only yeah, I hardly
That's
say
right.
anything.
That's right.
Yeah, Spanish. Spanish is useful. Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba. Um, and so go places, be open to the culture, the food, for example. Find the similarities. Uh, Try to adjust. Don't be an ugly American. So I think that young woman should just go places. I met a young woman um, who said, "I read your article in Essence magazine about Brazil. It was called Brazil, Africa, and the Americas." And she said, "Because of your article, I had to go to Brazil. I, I
Mm.
found an exchange program. I took some courses there. I learned some Portuguese. And so I was hoping I'd meet you at some point so I could say thank you." Wow.
Oh. Do not forget to submit your questions for the next episode because you never know. It could be your question that will be picked out. You just never know.
Yes, and Dr. Walker, to you, we say obrigada, ashe, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. We thank you for blessing us with your conversation and your presence. And we want to congratulate you to say welcome because you are now an official inductee into the VIP club, the VIP MyPad suite. Woo!
Wow.
Woo!
So many gems you've dropped, for us, and we thank you because our listeners, and more in ourselves, both of us, we're just like mind blown away, and it's so much
Blown.
knowledge that you shared with us, and so we just thank you so much, and we thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and we want to make sure that you tune into the next episode of the Voices of Influential People, the VIP podcast, because you just never know who our next VIP might be. So that's been it for us today. We thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Walker. We can't wait to have you on again if you will have the time and space, and we just thank you and thank you more for being my fellow co-host.
Thank you
And
so
that's it
much,
for
Aziza.
us.
Thanks, Dr. Walker. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And we're signing off.